Good afternoon, everybody. It's 4 o'clock, so we'll make a start. It is lovely to speak to you after about 6 weeks, some of which that time I've been on furlough, and obviously we stopped this policy update at the point at which the submission of this central assessed grades and rank order process had finished. But a lot of people said that they still had questions, particularly around issues around confidentiality this summer, around this issue, this whole big issue around data subject access request. And of course, in the last month, we've had a lot of updates from the DFE. As usual, all of you are muted just to avoid any background noise. And we ask that you continue to stay muted just so there's no crackling in the background. If you would like to ask any questions at any point as we go through or make any comments or any observations, please do use the chat function on Zoom. And my colleague Mike is around to ask questions on your behalf and interrupt me if there are any sort of urgent points of clarification. So first of all, I'm going to start by thinking about this issue of this summer. Of course, we now have submitted the grades, that part's over, but that's not the end of the story, of course. So I'm going to talk a bit about confidentiality, the FOIs and the subject access requests, but also what will happen on those days in August. So I think just as we go into the school holidays and potentially you have less access or less contact with your staff on a daily basis, I think one thing to really stress to those staff is the issue of confidentiality continuing until results day. So until both the 13th of August and the 20th of August, schools and teachers must keep those grades completely confidential. And that includes both kind of directly or indirectly staff indicating the grades that they've given. So, if a student emails over the next couple of weeks and says, "Oh, sir, can you tell me what I have?" and they say, "Well, think about your last mock grade or think about what your predicted grade was," it could be considered exam malpractice. So just a reminder to staff in the last week of term about that confidentiality. But as we've previously talked about, and we've talked about with the lawyers Wrigley's, before that happens, since lockdown in March, on results day and after results day, students can request their central assessed grade, their rank order, and any information that you have on them that relates to either of those pieces of data and to how those decisions were made. And they can do that through a subject access request. So just a reminder of what that regulation is. Under the Data Protection Act, better known as GDPR, both you as schools, as exam centres, and the awarding organisations are deemed to be data controllers. So when you're looking up the data regulations, you are deemed to be a data controller with relation to central assessed grade and rank order. So Ofqua's guidance states that you should have a clear process by which students can request their central assessed grade and rank order and how you respond to that. But even without the Ofqual guidance that came out 2 weeks ago, of course, the Data Regulation Act is still in play, and so we still are legally bound by that particular act. So just a reminder about the difference between an FOI, a freedom of information, and a subject access request. What it actually is will depend on the wording of the request, and there is no particular form, there's no particular wording that has to be used. It's all about interpretation. Essentially, an FOI to you would be about how you went about as a school making those decisions about central assessed grades. That might include any documentation that was given out to heads of department or to teachers about the process that was used, whether, for example, it was purely based on the last mock result or whether it was a more nuanced judgment, and so on. And that is something, any documentation like that, you could just put up on your website already, and just, if you have those requests, point people to that. What's probably more likely is a subject access request, which is where students are asking for their grade and their rank order, and again, potentially, depending on the wording of the request, any documentation that relates to that. So again, this is all stuff that we have talked about 6 weeks ago, but just to remind you of what constitutes a subject access request. Well, it's any verbal or written request for personal data, whether or not the subject knows that they're making a subject access request or not. So all of those verbal and written messages that teachers have had where they say, Miss, can you tell me your grade? Legally, that could constitute a subject access request. There is no formal language that has to be used. I don't have to mention the word subject access request, just saying, you've got my central assessed grade, can you tell me what it is? That is legally viable. So email, Zoom chat, WhatsApp messages, any of these should be followed up and should have been already logged. And one of the common questions that I've had from you about this is there's a potential tension here because students might not know they're making that. A lot of students were happy to be told that you're not allowed to tell them, and that was the end of the conversation. And actually, by following it up again and interpreting it as a subject access request, they don't want that. They don't realise that. And actually, it's creating an additional problem and isn't necessarily in the right interest of the students and the school and the relationship between you. But legally, you are obliged to do that. So it's a difficult situation. And I think it requires a degree of integrity about when you genuinely think a subject access request is being made. But the legal standpoint would be any verbal or written request for that data. So that includes those very brief messages. So what do you have to provide and when? Well, if you've had any verbal or written requests made before results day, i.e. since lockdown started in March, already that should have been logged and sent to your school or MAP's data protection officer. Because the legislation has this exemption where you're not allowed to release that data yet, what it means is you either have to answer that request within 5 months or within 40 working days from results day, whatever is the shortest time period. So if it was back in March when that request was made, that may be that may be closer to the 5-month limit. If someone asks you the day before results day, you've actually got a whole 5-month window in which to get back to them, but you must acknowledge their request. If students ask that data on or after results day, that request must be followed up within the usual 1-month time period. Exactly what you have to provide depends on the wording of the request. If they simply ask for the grade they were given by the school, then that's easy enough. You just give the centre assessed grade over. If they say something like, could you tell me what grade you gave me and how you reached that decision, then that's where you would have to provide any written documentation, information that you have as a data controller that relates to that decision. So that could be emails between staff. It would include deleted emails because of your data retention policy. It would include recorded meetings. And obviously, since 2018, all of that information, any information by any data controller, any organisation, has got to be linked to their particular account so that your data protection officer can find that. Now, of course, early on in 2018 and 2019, a lot of businesses' GDPR practices were put to the test. And I'm sure many of you were happily sort of unsubscribing from emails from various different shops and commercial organisations and asking what data they had on you. This is the first time, I think, in a real way, that schools' GDPR is going to be really tested. And so hopefully we're all in a position where we did implement that legislation in 2018 and our data protection officers are fully up to date with that 2018 legislation. But I think this is the first time that schools are going to be really tested by that legislation. One of the...
Just before you carry on, we've just had a comment come in on this point. So the comment is, if the question is, Miss, can you tell me my grade? The answer, no, the rules say I can't tell you because it's confidential, is a valid answer to that question in terms of the sense of the question.
Yes, absolutely. Again, because I mean, this is I'm not a lawyer, but this is all an interpretation of the law. I would agree with that analysis in that if someone is asking for their grade, then you can say that's confidential, and you can say that it is currently being calculated by the exam boards. And when they get their calculated grade, that's fine, absolutely. If the question was, sir, Miss, can you tell me the grade you are giving me as a school, that would be different. So again, hopefully people can appreciate that the difference in that. It's all about the request itself. And this is again why I think it's really important that all teaching staff understand the difference between that. Does that make sense? Has there been a follow-up comment, Mike?
A thank you comment, yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, absolutely. If they've just said, can you tell me my grade, and they haven't specified that it's the grade the school are giving them, then I agree in answer saying, no, that's confidential. It's being calculated by the exam boards and you'll get it on the 20th of August. Absolutely, that's fine. It's more that they are asking specifically for the grade the teacher is giving them. And that's a really important nuance. So thank you for that interruption. On this, I mean, again, what I should say is I really, really hope that this isn't a big issue in the summer, but we anticipate it could be. Of course, students and families that are wised up to this may well ask exactly for that, their central assessed grade, but also their rank order. One of the things that I've been talking a lot to the DFE about is the fact that under the legislation at the moment, it says it's up to you as schools to decide whether releasing the rank order will, whether disclosing that will reveal another student's personal data. So if you have a small A-level group and there are only 2 students within that rank, then within that grade, sorry, then of course revealing their rank will reveal another student's personal data, and therefore you can legitimately not give that data over. You can be exempt from giving that data. However, there is no cutoff being given by either Ofqual or the DFE or the Information Controller's Office, the ICO. So again, yet another challenge that we have before August is you as schools have to decide on a case-by-case basis when disclosing a rank order will give away another student's personal data. So clearly GCSE English and Maths is unlikely to fall in that category unless you only have a very small number at the tops and bottoms. But what I would suggest you do at this period, so that you've made a decision as an SLT in consultation with your data protection officer and any relevant people from your authority or your trust, is to say, you know, what do we think is a reasonable limit? Is it 5 students in a rank? And we say no. After that, we said we can't do that. Again, hopefully it won't be an issue, but if you make these decisions now, then hopefully it will streamline that process in the summer. One of the questions we've had from several schools, and I know several of them actually are on the chat today, is whether you can provide central assessed grades to all students on results day. So this is, you know, in anticipation that you might have a very large number of formal requests or informal, but that are subject access requests. So can you just give all of your students their central assessed grades on results day? The answer simply is yes at the moment, as far as we know. Of course, if that changes or if there's any other guidance, SSAT will let you know immediately, and particularly those schools that have particularly asked for it. But at the moment, yep, you're totally allowed to do that. So it's only confidential up until the results day. Of course, however you do that must be in line with other ICO guidelines. So you couldn't do a notice board with everyone's grades, you know, posted on the school website or in person, for example. It would need to, you know, you can't release other people's personal data, and of course should be in line with your school's data policy. I think whatever you do, whether you're choosing to provide a central assessed grade for all students on results day, whether you're going to be there if you're opening virtually and have someone with central assessed grades and a place where students can go to find it out if they want to, or if you're just doing it on a case-by-case basis as the requests come in, whatever you're doing, I think you need to really carefully think through what the relationship is between the students, families, and your school. If you think releasing all of the central assessed grades will potentially be damaging for that relationship and the trust that you've built up over time, then obviously maybe that's not the way to go about it. If equally you think that's being transparent and that's being open about what you did as a school, that's up to you. But legally at the moment, yes, there's nothing to stop you. But again, if that changes, we'll let you know that there is nothing to stop you. And then, of course, I think there's also an issue here. Again, not saying it's the wrong thing to do, but protecting the well-being of staff. And if at the start of this process, you told teaching staff that students wouldn't be told their centre assessed grade unless they made this legal request for it, and then you decide as an SLT to change that and say, actually, no, we're going to tell all students their centre assessed grades, but you've previously told staff something different, I think it's worth thinking through the implications on individual members of staff, particularly those who might be teaching in the sixth form or might be teaching other members of the family in future years. So again, just thinking through what was that initial message that you told staff. So just here, I've tried to sort of do a kind of quick data checklist to run through in the last week of term. So just before you break up, do all staff really understand that 2018 legislation? Have you re-sent out any initial training that you did 2 years ago about that, so staff are reminded about what that is? And do they know how they're supposed to log any of those requests? And again, maybe into some of that nuance, it's requests for the grade that you have set as a school. And actually, do teachers and all staff know who your data controller is and who they should be referring those requests to? Are you confident that all of that information, all of those emails, those deleted emails, those Zoom chats, they are all linked to your CRM or whatever data system you use, and that can be accessed easily? If not, have you talked to your data controller, your data officer, about how confident you are you could respond within that 1 month or 40-day time period? Have you revisited your data protection policy and made sure that's up to date on your website? Because again, that's something that we might find this summer. Hopefully not, but we might find this summer students and parents looking at, so it's up to date. Have you thought about that streamlined process for requesting this data this summer? We know it might be a bigger issue than usual, so maybe it's not a case of just referring people to your data protection policy. Maybe you have a specific section of your website or your guidance area that talks about that. And as I've already said, having made that decision about where you as a data center are going to, as a data controller, where you're going to draw the line in terms of rank order and the number of students in any one grade. So moving on, we know a little bit more about what standardization will look like. This came out yesterday from Ofqual. So remember, you sent in your central assessed grades and rank order. It's now been put through the standardization process. There are 3 things that takes account of: the prior attainment of your cohort of students, the national predicted statistics about grade distribution, and your school's prior results. We've now got the information about the second of those things, the national expected grade statistics. So for English and maths, they will look to find out, to look at what they expect to happen at the 2017 and 2018 results, but not 2019. Very strangely, we were not expecting that. For the other reform subjects, so for most GCSEs, they'll look at 2018 and 2019 results. For any new reform subjects, which there's only a handful of, it will be similar to previous years when they've introduced the reform subjects since 2017. So we don't yet know what that means for school level standardization. Of course, we're assuming they would use the data from the last 3 years for English and Maths and the last 2 years for other GCSEs. That's not the case in the national data. So we will wait to see whether the 2019 data for English and Maths is used at a school level. Of course, if it is or isn't, will benefit some schools and disadvantage others, depending if 2019 was a stronger or weaker year for you as a school. So that would be really interesting. Unfortunately, that formula is embargoed until results day. So we won't know until results day exactly what that school level standardisation looks like. I'm going to pause there, so I think we may have had a comment or a question. Mike, has something come in?
No, nothing's coming in yet.
No, okay, that's fine. So, but just to bear in mind, I know some of you were looking at your 3-year average for English and Maths. Really interesting that for national standardisation, it's only looking at 2017 and 2018, and 2019 has been excluded. Don't know why. Which yeah,
something now has just come in. So could a student just ask for a centre assessed grade in one or a couple of subjects, but not all of them? And what would the implications of that be?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of, yeah, and that's the whole point. It's this really granular thing where a student could say to one individual teacher, Ms. Jones, can you tell me what I've got in geography? And in that case, you only need to say what you gave me in geography. You only need to answer that one particular request. Of course, where I think students and families might be a bit more savvy or a bit more clued up or a bit wised up about it, is you might get a request for all of their centre assessed grades and the rank order and the documentation that relates to that. I mean, that's kind of worst case scenario. That's where you have to do everything. But absolutely, it could just be one or two subjects. Yeah, it all depends on the nature of the request, but any request should be locked, and that includes an individual subject one. Yeah.
Just more of another comment, I think, rather than a question, but how is it fair that the 2019 Maths and English results aren't being included?
No idea. I said genuinely shocked by it. Really didn't expect it. Bear in mind, this is the national grade distribution that they're working out, which will affect you less directly as schools and affect you less affect students less. I just don't understand it personally, but I mean, my hope is they won't apply that same methodology to the school standardisation part of it. But we will wait to see. There's been some early indication that around 40% of schools will expect to see, of grade candidates will expect to see their centre assessed grades moved. So it will be substantial, but we won't know that until the day.
And then just, is there any significance that you know of about the 2019 results not being included?
No, as I said, this only came out yesterday, and I have asked about it and I've not had a reply yet. So that's what I'm trying to understand, if there's a particular reason why the English and Maths 2019 wasn't used. It may be something to do with trying to, I don't know, this is really speculation, but it could be something about trying to get parity between them. So saying we'll use the first 2 years of results from the reformed qualifications in all subjects, including English and Maths, even though we have 3 years, with an idea that maybe, school, as you'd expect, schools get better over time at new frameworks, but new specifications. But I don't know. Yeah. In the interest of time, I'll move on and I'll come back to Mike with any further questions and comments later. To look at appeals. Grounds for appeals are very, very limited. Students really can't appeal on many accounts at all. Students themselves can't appeal. It has to be done through you as a centre. The only real grounds for appeals are if the data that was used was somehow corrupted or inputted wrongly. So essentially what you gave the exam board somehow got corrupted and wasn't used properly. Students themselves cannot appeal their centre assessed grade or rank unless they can prove there has been bias against them, which I think would be a very, very difficult thing to prove. And I think the only way of looking at that would be if they've got, if they have evidence they've got kind of grade 7s in every one of their mock exams, but they were given a grade 4 or something like that. But on the whole, it would be very, very difficult to prove bias. And equally, you as schools, you cannot appeal the whole data set based on the standardization formula or mitigating circumstances. So if you were genuinely expecting better results this summer with a similar cohort because of improved curriculum, better interventions, better teaching and learning, the fact that Ramadan fell outside of the exams this year, any of those things, you can't appeal on those bases. It will be pegged to your previous results. And as I said, students can appeal if there's any evidence of bias or exam malpractice. So instead, we do have the autumn series, and as you know, I was pretty firmly against the autumn series, but we do now have the autumn series for all subjects, for all exam boards, and they have got to put those on and start preparing for them. The Octobers will be in A-level, the A-levels will be in October, the GCSEs in November. The exams themselves will look the same, and they'll be the same number as the qualifications usually. It will all be exam-based, so we know non-exam assessment apart from art and design. And it's worth remembering that only students who are entered for the summer series are eligible for that autumn series. So only students who have been entered for this summer can enter that autumn series. You can't put additional cohorts of students in. Interestingly, even though the exam boards have to put this in, there is no legal obligation on you as a school to offer the autumn series. Now, of course, what that means in reality is Ofqual are saying they strongly urge schools and colleges to work together to ensure that any student who wants to sit the autumn series can do, but you have no legal obligation to. So if you decide it is wrong for students to be resitting the exams, you don't have to put those on legally. And as those of you that heard me speak about this know, I really doubt the usefulness of an autumn resit. The whole point of this year is focusing on progression. A vast majority of students aged 16 will get into their sixth form or FE college of choice. Maybe there'll be a handful of students who don't get the grades they need to go to the university or the university course of their choice. But by this point, they've already missed out on that starting this year. And so again, I'm not sure how helpful it is for that to do that autumn series. But again, the advice you give will depend on your particular context and your particular need. So with that in mind, a few considerations around results day. Are you opening your school up, or are you doing this virtually while you prepare your school for a full reopening in September? Based on some research that Pearson did, they suggest it's about half and half. From their evidence, about 50% of schools are planning to open in person, 50% will do results virtually. However you do it, I think we need to really think about the support that we're giving students, particularly this year. Not to be morbid, but it's only a couple of months since we had the coroner's report of Owen Williams, which you may remember from the headlines, was a tragic case of an A-level student who received his grades online at 6 in the morning last August, and they weren't what he wanted, and he felt he had no one to talk to, and he took his own life. Really awful circumstance, but particularly in these very, very difficult times, if students are receiving their grades virtually, what support are you offering? Are you making sure that all students will be contacted throughout the day to talk through their options? Have you talked to your teachers, both kind of heads of department and pastoral leads about the careers advice and guidance this particular year? I think the conversations that you'd usually have with colleges and universities about whether students can continue their studies is going to be different this year. Again, both have said they're going to be much more flexible. Universities are going to be desperate for undergraduates, that they won't have many international undergraduates, and we have the lowest number of 18-year-olds we've had in decades. So universities are going to be desperate for undergraduates. And again, that real focus on progression on results day. Yes, this has been a difficult year. Yes, they haven't been able to prove themselves in the exam, and it's been based on teacher assessment and the standardization formula. But if they've got into the next stage of their education, that's the important bit. If they're doing what they wanted to do, that's the thing to focus on. So again, just some considerations to maybe work through. I'll pause there very briefly and see if there's any comments or questions. Mike.
Yep, just a couple really. So going back to grades based on previous results, could I ask how would it work for new schools who do not yet have a data set to pin their results to?
Yeah, we've been asking that a lot. All Ofqual keep telling us is there is provision for that, but again, that whole formula is embargoed until results day. So we have been asking, we don't know.
Okay, moving on to the autumn series. I'm assuming that a resit would happen in college if a school does not have a sixth form.
Well, again, this is the interesting point about it. There is no legal obligation on either you as a school or the sixth form college or FE college to put the resits on. The guidance is quite woolly there. It says that you should work together to ensure that any students that want to resit can resit. But I would imagine, and the point is that there is no legal obligation. So yes, I think typically you would expect those resits to happen in a college. But of course, colleges are not used to doing GCSEs apart from the resits in English and maths. And so again, they won't be used to that. So again, because there is no legal obligation, that's a decision for you to have with your local providers. Again, it might be that as a local group of schools or a local cluster of schools, you decide that actually one school is going to offer that. But there is no legal framework that says either you or the college has to do that. Just a sort of strong indication that students should be able to resit if they want to.
Okay, next question is around private candidates who have been intended to enter in the summer series, but for whom the school couldn't produce a CAG.
Yeah.
Are they still eligible for the autumn series?
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back to this slide here, the fifth bullet point there is slightly wrong. It's not only students who received a calculated grade this summer, it's only students who were entered in for the summer series back in February. So yes, absolutely, private candidates who you said, sorry, we can't give you a grade, they can sit the autumn series. Yeah.
Okay, we've had a few more come in as well. So if external ex-students were not given central assessed grades and needed to sit the exams in the autumn series to move on to university, does it mean they cannot be entered for the autumn series exams?
Yeah, again, so same question, just slightly bad wording on my part there on that bullet point. If they were entered for the summer, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. As an exam officer, I've been told by our exam boards that the original entering school should enter the schools who want to resit.
I think that is what the exam boards are pushing for in my conversation for them. But the point I want to make is there is absolutely no legal obligation. Legitimately, if you turn around and say it's not right for our curriculum to do that, you don't have to. That may be tested, but that, I can point people to where it says that in the exemplary, exceptional legislation. There is no requirement for you to do that. Much as, in a way, there's no requirement for you to actually put on any particular GCSE. Obviously there's the expectation, but if you, for example, choose not to offer a particular technology, but a school down the road does, or you don't offer Latin and a school down the road does, there's no statutory requirement that you have to offer any particular qualification. And it's the same this autumn. So it's sort of worth bearing that in mind. But yeah.
On a similar theme, if a student was entered in February but withdrawn, can they enter students for the autumn series?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. And then final question that we've got at the moment: do you have any information on exam board fees? Schools are expected to pay for exam entries and other implications, and they've already paid for summer series. No,
nothing about that. Formally, I would imagine that the expectation is that comes out of the top-up funding that's been announced, but there's nothing formal on that. Yeah, which was one reason, by the way, I was very against an autumn series, because I worried that it means that schools that are in better paid authorities are more have greater access to offer a greater number of those subjects. But there we go. And we're up to date with questions. Great. I'm going to move on quickly because timing. but we can address any other ones later. So looking at the DfE guidance that came out last week on the 2nd. So just a few key starting points. Of course, as you now know, all students back all the time, teaching a full, broad and balanced curriculum. However, I think a missed out point in the main media has been that guidance says there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and school leaders need to make decisions based on their own local context. So it is not that you need to implement that guidance to the letter. The guidance also says explicitly that it brings in no new legal duties. Where something's a matter of public health, that's already a statutory matter, and the word must is used. So if you are going through that guidance again, it may be worth just getting a highlighter and just highlighting where you see that word must, because that is explicitly in the document where they say there's something you have to do. All of the rest of it is a framework and is a guidance, but explicitly is up to you about how you implement it based on your local context. So I think that's a point that's been missed out a lot. It is a framework, it is not legislation. So just running through the key points in each of the sections. So the public health advice, this is the kind of mandatory bit. More frequent hand washing, the catch it, bin it, kill it approach to public health, more cleaning of particularly public spaces and equipment more frequently, and minimise contact and promote social distancing where possible. If a student develops symptoms of COVID-19, they shouldn't attend school, obviously, and if they develop those symptoms whilst at school, then they should be taken to a separate room, kept behind a closed door, if it's appropriate, with an open window. They should have access to a separate toilet. Any staff that helped them in that period when they had symptoms don't need to self-isolate unless they themselves develop symptoms. So obviously the big timetable curriculum issue that you will have, and I'm sure you're already on top of, is the idea of bubbles. So at primary and at key stage 3, particularly sort of year 7 where possible, the suggestion is that it's class size of up to 30. If that's not possible at key stage 3, and certainly for key stage 4 where you have smaller optional subjects, then those bubbles can be whole year group sized. Again, the framework is that you minimise contact between those bubbles, so that could be having staggered breaks or staggered start and finish times. Of course, there's a whole workload issue there where you could have staff working really much earlier in the day and finishing much later if you have significantly longer start and finish times. Other suggestions that schools are using are having sort of zones, so rather than having staggered breaks, that actually you break the whole school up into 5 or 7 different zones, and year groups stay within their zone at all times, including lunches. So you don't have a canteen service as such, but the canteen only offers packed lunches that are delivered to that particular zone. So that's one way we've heard a lot of schools are intending to go to avoid having to stagger breaks and start and finish times. Siblings can be in different bubbles. There should be no assemblies or meetings larger than the bubble itself. Teachers can move between bubbles, but they should stay 2 meters away from students if they're doing that, and the use of staff rooms is to be avoided. What the framework says very clearly is it's not an all or nothing model. So if you can't operate a bubble system exactly as it says, it doesn't mean that you just don't reopen. You do it by key stage, or you do it as much as you can. So it's not all or nothing, and it's not a case that if you can't do it, you just don't open school buildings. Obviously engage in test and trace, but again, it says you don't need to ask for evidence of students' tests. So if students say they test negative or positive, you take their word for it. You don't need to see evidence of that. And if 2 or more students within a bubble test positive, then obviously you discuss that with your local health team, and they may request that the entire bubble self-isolates for 14 days. So in terms of operational activity, obviously a lot of focus on transport, and the big focus there is if you're using dedicated school transport, that you try and match that to bubbles, so you have the same bubbles travelling on the same transport. But again, that's not all or nothing. If you're using public transport, then again, you consider changing the time of your school day so that students are not travelling during peak travel times. Attendance is, of course, now compulsory. Up until now, you've not had to record attendance in the same way, but from September, all students are expected in, and you should follow that up with the normal penalties that you would offer as a school. Shielding formally ends on the 1st of August, so if students have been shielding because of complications, they can come back into school from September. Equally, any staff can do that, and equally, if there are students who are living with critically vulnerable people, they too can come into school. So likewise, most staff should come in to school as shielding formally ends on the 1st of August. Educational visits are allowed from the start of September, but they shouldn't be residential. The DfE in the guidance recommend that you really have a focus on school uniform policies, and that obviously schools that have been open, as all of you have, for key workers, children, and disadvantaged students. Of many of you haven't had uniform policies in place, but they should be reinforced, and that uniforms don't need to be cleaned any more than usual. Extra curricular provisions, so your before and after school clubs, are encouraged in the document, and they can also operate as additional small bubbles. So, I mean, the whole thing is a bit strange, because you could have transport bubbles that are coming in together, you could have cohort bubbles who have been taught together, and you could have extracurricular bubbles who are taught together, and then of course you could have siblings who then go home together. So, I mean, it's all a bit of a nonsense, as I probably don't need to tell you. And a reminder in the documentation that staff obviously have the summer off, and they're free to have that leave, but they are expected back at the start of September. And if they choose to go on holiday, on a foreign holiday, to one of the countries that's not on the green list of the air bridge, then they will have to self-isolate for 14 days, which means they need to make sure they return back to the UK 2 weeks before the start of term. So if you do have staff that have holidays booked to the USA, to Portugal, anywhere that's not on the green list, they need to make sure they're back in the UK 2 weeks before the start of term, and they are self-isolating for that 14 days. So just a reminder at the end of term. So in terms of curriculum, behaviour and pastoral support, yeah, there was some suggestion that it would be focused down on just the core subjects, but no, expect to teach a full, broad and balanced curriculum. There is acknowledgement that probably it means that you're not teaching your normal curriculum in each of those subjects, and you're going to have to catch students up because they may not have received their normal amount of learning since March. But the expectation, this is a real challenge, is that your full school curriculum is back up to speed in all subjects by summer 2021. So you've essentially got 2 terms in which to catch all students up. So the plan of the curriculum should be based on formative assessment, and I think the formative assessment is going to play a really important part in making this happen. So in addition to replanning your curriculum, so you're back where you plan to be by next summer, you also, by the 30th of September, have got to be ready at a moment's notice to switch to a virtual curriculum, which should have the same amount of curriculum material as your normal school curriculum, plus at least a day, so at least every day, an interaction with a teacher. So by the start of September, you have to have your full, broad and balanced curriculum being taught to all students in all year groups. By the end of the year, by summer 2021, you have to be back where you would plan to be had COVID not happened. And at a moment's notice, by the 30th of September, you need to be ready to switch to an online curriculum if need be. So you can reduce some subjects until the summer, but should have a very clear rationale why you're doing that. And that's more of Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. At Key Stage 4, you can ask students to reduce an option, but again, there should be a very, very strong rationale for why you're doing that. The SRE, the new SRE curriculum, becomes compulsory from this September, and there's an expectation that schools will teach that new curriculum from the start of September. But of course, you do have the summer until the summer to catch up for that. There's a £650 million catch-up funding. We don't know what that looks like yet or how that will be distributed. Greater focus on pastoral support. It avoids the word recovery curriculum, but the idea of acknowledging that students will have had very different experiences of lockdown. Many will be will have bereavement or changes in their family circumstances, and a big focus on behaviour and a suggestion that schools revisit their behaviour policy and ensure it reflects that students keep socially distanced, they stay within their zones, they stay within their bubbles, and that there are sanctions if they don't, and an expectation that students will face the front of the room and not be seated in groups. 10 years of Nick Gibb being schools minister, it took a global pandemic for him to finally get the type of pedagogy that he wants. Accountability assessment I will come to in a moment because it's a slightly bigger topic than is in the framework. But just to finish this section, in terms of managing outbreaks, this is really looking at the remote learning. So we expect more outbreaks, whether that's from particular cohorts or whole towns. Of course, the first one of these is Leicester, and the reason for the Leicester outbreak is because it's being spread by under-19s, having been told for months and months and months that young people can't carry it or spread it. That's the reason for the outbreak in Leicester. But yeah, by the 30th of September, you should be ready to deliver that remote learning. And it should be the same amount of content and time as your in-school curriculum and must include daily interaction with teachers. And of course, the Open National Academy has been given an additional £450 million to support that. So I'll just pause there and see if there's any questions or comments before we move on to the final section, which is around accountability and assessment.
Yeah, just a couple of comments around the social bubble. So if a bubble is a year group, potentially 300 pupils, if 2 or more test positive, just asking for clarification that all 300 must isolate.
Yes, in a word. Essentially, you ask your public health team and they will advise you. But I mean, that's a suggestion in the document. But you wouldn't have to make that decision yourself. Your public health team would tell you that.
How do you know if 2 or more students test positive if they haven't told you their test results? Is there anything where the school should be informed?
Well, no. I mean, you rely on students telling you, and you rely on students and families to be using test and trace. And as with the rest of public health, it all relies on the public getting behind that particular initiative.
I think we may have covered this one, but for extracurricular provision, does this include things like ensembles and can we mix bubbles?
So again, it's all a framework, but the suggestion is that as much as possible, you try and limit those extracurricular bubbles. So, whether that's you keep them as key stages, ideally keep them in year groups. But yeah, you can include that. There are particular rules around contact sport, which you can't do, and music as well, including extracurricular music. Particularly the idea that any music practice should take place outside rather than inside, which would be lovely come November. But yeah, so there's particular rules about that.
So actually, there's just a comment comes in off the back of that, just saying with the ensembles, there's particular rules around singing and woodwind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Question, do we know what £650 million looks like for each child? If not, when will we know? Because everybody needs prior notice to be able to plan.
No idea. We don't know. We don't know whether it will be distributed equally to all schools equally, whether it be linked to disadvantage. We just don't know.
And then in terms of student data, there is not any data for KS2 students moving to secondary in September. Is there any information about how these students will be tested and how will P8 work?
Great. Well, let me continue then, because I will touch on that in the next section. So thinking about accountability and Ofsted. Full Section 5 and Section 8 inspections are suspended until January. However, from September, Ofsted visits, not inspections, will start up again. and they will be focused on how effective you as a school are at reintegrating students and bringing back your curriculum, how you're managing returns, and how prepared you are for blended or fully remote learning. The expectation is that all inadequate schools will be visited between September and December, as well as a sample of RI good and outstanding schools. Because it's not an inspection, there will be no formal judgment, but there will be a published letter that goes to parents and tells parents how well the school is helping students get back to their normal curriculum, and inspectors could decide that it will result in further action, which is the phrase used, which I assume means a full inspection, if deemed appropriate. We don't know exactly what inspectors will be looking at yet. The operational note will come out in September, but it won't be the full EIF. And as is now with inspection, schools will have 1 day's notice of an Ofsted visit. So, you know, yes, it's not an inspection, but there will be a public letter out in the domain, and it could result, it could trigger, that visit could trigger further action from Ofsted. So, school performance measures in 2020, no data published as we know for any school. That data will not appear anywhere, literally anywhere. So it won't be used in future inspections, and it shouldn't be used for performance management internally either. So with this in mind, I mean, nobody will be able to see your data at all. In August, have you thought about what's the narrative you're going to tell? What is the message that you want to send out about exams this year? Because you won't be able to, well, you can say if you want to, this percentage of students got this grade or higher, but that will not be in the public domain unless you choose to put it out there. And this is the question that was asked right at the end of the last section. How will the fact that we don't have Key Stage 2 data for incoming Year 7s play out in the future? On a national level, we don't know yet. We don't know what it will mean for progress measures in 2028. We don't know what it will mean for transition matrices for 2028. So in the meantime, while we don't know what it looks like nationally, what plans do you have in place to baseline your Year 7s, given you won't have the usual Key Stage 2 marks? On this point as well, when we're thinking about this curriculum and that we've got 2 terms to catch it up to normal, you know, have your Year 7 teachers looked at the Key Stage 2 curriculum? Because it's quite likely that those Year 6s may have missed out on some of their learning during that time. So it might just be worth looking back at the Key Stage 2 curriculum as well. School performance measures next year. So the Key Stage 2 tests have been confirmed as going ahead. There is a lot of speculation that the Key Stage 4 and 5 ones won't in the same way. However, there are various government documents that suggest that they will. So we don't know what it looks like yet. It could be just a progress measure just based on English and maths. My gut feeling, given that there have been all of these sort of documents that talk about performance measures, is they might push for the full range of Key Stage 4 performance measures in 2021. So just a reminder that if you had early entries in Year 10 or Year 12 this summer, they will not count if those performance measures goes ahead. There are 2 particular situations that I think are quite common and will affect schools. One is if you have early entry for one of the Englishes, typically English language, in Year 10. Obviously, you won't be able to include that English in the open bucket of attainment and progress 8. But equally, it's unlikely that the English that does count will be double weighted. So you always take a double hit. And the other consideration is A-level students who are doing further maths. A very typical curriculum model is for them to sit there, A-level maths in Year 12, but that won't count next year in your Key Stage 5 progress measures, even though those students tend to be very high ability, hence doing further maths. But again, for 2 particular circumstances where they won't count. So one of the questions that we were asked a lot before I went off was what the exams look like in 2020. Will there be reduced content? We now have the answer to that. For most subjects, in most exams, the full content is expected to be covered. That's for the simple reason that schools teach the material in different orders, so it would be unfair to just remove the last fifth from the specification. There are some exemptions from assessment, so there is no requirement to do speaking and listening in the English language. You don't have to do experiments in science, and you don't have to do the current geography field trip. And equally, changes to the pedagogy, so students can watch experiments in science rather than do them themselves. They can watch teachers using machines rather than using themselves in DT, and they can watch a streamed theatre production rather than attend a theatre production in person, as is currently the case for GCSE drama. There may be some content sampling, we're waiting to hear about this, but there will definitely be no content sampling, i.e. removal of content in English, maths, any of the sciences, or any of the A levels. There will be some optionality in history GCSE, that's the only one, where students can opt in for one choice of question, and that's an acknowledgement that the history GCSE is the largest GCSE in terms of content compared to the typical number of hours that it's taught in schools. Potential for all or some exams to be pushed back till after the 7th of June. I think that's quite likely, certainly for English, Maths and Sciences, but we will wait to see the final exam timetable. And of course, what the DFE is saying, what Gavin Williams is saying is, well, Ofqual can use their current method of standardisation, where we make sure that the results are the same, roughly the same each year, to ensure parity. So if every year 11 does less well next summer because of this year's lockdown, that would be reflected in the pass marks. Of course, the difficulty there is that we know that more advantaged students and students that attend private schools have received more online curriculum, more online tuition. So we would expect to see that disadvantage gap grow further in 2021. Sorry, the top of that slide should say exams in 2021, not 2020. There's obviously no exams this summer. So on this slide, I showed the final session I did just before I went off, but just some curriculum questions you may want to work through as a school. As an SLT, do you have a strong handle on the extent to which your school curriculum has been delivered? Could you almost like map that out? Is it different to different subjects? But do you have a sense of that as an SLT? On school reopenings, how will you use existing or new formative assessment strategies to find out what students know and what they don't know? If you want to know more about SSAT and formative assessment, then please do search for our work on formative assessment and Dylan William. And we have a programme designed by Dylan that's all about embedding these deep formative assessment strategies. Do your Key Stage 3 students know the Key Stage 2 national curriculum? What about this idea of recovery curriculum, the idea that students may suffer bereavement and so on? The big focus for Ofsted in their visits will be how you close the disadvantage gap, and have you thought about how your disadvantage profile may have changed in the last sort of 48 hours. Obviously, we had 12,000 jobs lost last week, but we've since had Rishi Sunak's message about the mini budget. So, do you have a sense of what your disadvantage profile looks like going into September? Because it may be very different from where we were in March. It might be quite different from even a week ago. Are you ready for this period of blended learning? Will you be ready by the end of September? And how do you have issues of workload? What are the issues around workload there? Are you expecting staff to maybe be teaching in person to one cohort and then go to their classroom and be teaching virtually to another? Are you going to keep a group of staff with one or two members of staff at home to be able to deliver online learning as it's needed as different groups go off? What are your changes to the planned timetable, and what are those further cultural and capital challenges? So very, very quickly to finish off, just some other considerations. Home learning, as I said, we know that wealthier students are far more likely to have accessed a greater amount of home learning than disadvantaged students. The IFS suggests that's averaging at 1 hour 15 minutes per day, i.e. a whole day a week. And yet it is the least advantaged parents who are least likely to send their children back to school in June and in September. So that could potentially be an ongoing situation. In terms of our policy, the other thing just to have on your horizon, it's really not the big consideration now, but it's interesting that the DfE have are appointing 12 new policy advisors, that they've got past Dominic Cummings. It's a huge number of policy advisors to one department to focus specifically on FB and HE. In particular, Gavin Williamson is very interested in the idea that students apply for university after results. And these are some of the options that he's looking at. And you can see some of those that have quite a big implication for your Key Stage 5 curriculum. And finally, the funding announcements that have happened over the last week or so. So 560 million for building repairs for the school estate, plus additional money for existing projects. That 650 million catch-up funding for schools and colleges, we don't know what that looks like yet. In addition to that, 350 million for one-to-one catch-up tuition. Again, we don't know how that'll be distributed. 101 million for 18 to 19-year-olds returning to school for an additional year, sort of year 14, to do valuable level 2 and 3 courses. So again, that's something that if you have a sixth form, you may well be accessing that fund, and that schools can apply to be part of the £1 billion energy efficient grants, which allows you to update your buildings to be more energy efficient. So I'll just pause there for any final questions or comments, and then talk about the next updates we'll be doing.
Just a few more questions come in. So exams in 2021. You mentioned about the science, but will there still be questions on required experiments in GCSE science?
No, so I think that's the point. It won't assume that students have done any experiments.
Okay. Performance measures. Our local authority have this year requested that we send them our results data on results day for the GCSE students, which they haven't asked for before. Have you got any theories as to why?
I'd be interested in which authority is doing that. I'd be interested in if other schools have been asked the same question from their authority. I think it's a very weird thing to ask, and I would really push back and question why the authority want to know it. The DfE have been so very, very clear here that it is not about school level data. And I would make that very clear and say, well, ask that question why you want to know. There's certainly no requirement that authorities need to ask for that.
As a follow-on, you may not be able to answer this, but do you think that they could refuse?
Yes. I mean, well, on a legal point of view, yes, absolutely. There's no requirement this summer to publish your results for anyone. It obviously depends on the nature of your school governance and your relationship with the authority, but or indeed your central multi-academy trust. But yes, absolutely could refuse. There is no reason why you have to give your data to anyone. It's about the students and their qualifications. I think the way it's really hard to think about it in this way, but it's almost like saying all those measures don't exist. Like they're not there. They're literally not there. It's about the students' qualifications and what they get. Whether you got this percentage above grade 4 or grade 5, it's almost just not there. I mean, you could actually, rather than refuse, what you could say to an authority is, well, we're not working that out because we don't need to. It's about students' qualifications and their progression. We're just not working that out. We don't want to know.
There is a comment on this just to say that you do have to pass on the data for CIC students.
That is true. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but again, that's the point about individual students rather than an institutional percentage type thing. Yeah.
Then there's just a comment on the SRE curriculum, just saying that the DfE has said that it must be in place for 2021 if schools are not ready as a result of COVID.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying, by summer 2021.
Yeah. And then the final comment, this is around central assessed grades again. So our business manager was in a meeting this morning about GDPR and legal issues, CAGs. She was advised that some schools are sharing their CAGs before the results are issued. We've also heard from exam officers forums that some schools are doing the same. it was suggested that it was a strategy about focusing attention back on exam boards if students are disappointed. Any advice?
Right. Well, first off, absolutely that is illegal to share the centre assessed grades before the publication of results day. This is so unequivocally, you cannot do that. It is exam malpractice. Whether or not you want to release the centre assessed grade on the same day as results day, as category grades, that is up to you. And as I said, it really will be a school decision, and it's thinking through the different implications. Yes, it's likely for most schools that your centre assessed grade will probably be higher than their calculated grade. And so yes, maybe it deflects the situation onto the exam boards and the government and says, well, look, it's out of our control. But if you still have students who say, well, why even in the first place did you give me that grade? Well, I think I should be 2 grades higher. And they haven't requested the grade in the first place. That's what I'm saying about kind of thinking through what is going to be most helpful for you as a school. And that will really depend on your context and the extent to which you think students are going to request that information anyway. But yeah, just to be really clear, you cannot give those centre assessed grades before results day.
And that is all the questions.
Lovely. Were there any more? I'll stay on for a few minutes afterwards to answer any. Either feel free to ask in the chat or to just unmic yourself. Just to say, I am going back on furlough as after tomorrow for 4 weeks, but I'll be back for the results days to look at all of this, and we will do updates on the results day again at 4 o'clock for both A-level and GCSE. In the meantime, do continue to get support from SSAT from a relationship manager. And also, this is maybe the last chance I speak to many of you before we break for the summer holidays. I should also say that at the end of the summer holidays, I'll be leaving SSAT very sadly and starting a new job with the Association of School and College Leaders. But please do continue to get information and advice from your relationship managers, and of course all of the policy support and the email forums will continue from the 1st of September. But in the meantime, try and have a break over July and August, and I look forward to seeing you on results day. Good luck. Thank you.